Hey folks, I know I missed last week's episode, and I know I'm getting a late start this week. That's because I was meeting with my spiritual advisors, and have been meeting with my spiritual advisors actually just up until right now, a minute ago. I got off the phone with my spiritual advisors, and I have something to confess to all of you, to all of the fans out there, which is that I'm a fraud. I'm not Santa Cruz's number one um, Microsoft PowerPoint streamer. I don't even stream PowerPoint, and I feel like that I gotta get this off my chest. Um, I have been streaming all along. I've been streaming Google Slides, not PowerPoint. And I know what a lot of people say. It's that the difficulty threshold for streaming Google Slides is a lot lower. Um, there's a lot less kind of the learning curve is shallower. You can just get right. Anyone can stream Google Slides, and um, I get that. It's true. Anyone can stream Google Slides. I think it's democratic. It's great. So I just hope that I'm not gonna lose a lot of fans because of that. Um, okay, now to get on to the contents of today's, I repeat, Google Slides presentation, I want to start by again addressing something from last week, which is that um, I actually got a lot of suggestions for people who have the chicken neck, who have the head that is as big as their neck, who have the chicken neck, that are more appropriate than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, to whom, again, I apologize. I apologize to his legal team. We've been in communication. Um, so I just want to say that there are actually a lot of people, though, for whom this physiognomic diagnosis totally works. People who are just complete morons, greedy cowards, chicken-like personalities who have this chicken neck. Like, for instance, Jay Leno, I think his neck has actually gotten bigger and his head has shrunk as he aged. And he's got that weird chin that kind of distracts from it, but definitely he's got the neck and the head thing. And Sean Hannity, too, he's got a real chicken looking neck. He's got a waddle, actually, a little bit of a waddle going on here. Um, again, I want to apologize to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and say that these people should have occurred to me last week. These obvious chicken heads, for whom physiognomy totally works. Now, today's topic. Now, I'm sure that you've heard this said once or twice in your lives, maybe by your parents, maybe by your friends, maybe by a teacher. Do not sacrifice a white rooster, for it is a suppliant holy to the month, and that is why they, i.e. the roosters, indicate the hour. Now today I want to go in a little bit to what this slogan, this aphorism means, and where it comes from, and what it's all about. Because it's Pythagoras, baby, and it only gets better from here. Pythagoras. Who is Pythagoras? Well, we heard a little bit about Pythagoras last week, actually, that passage from Aulus Gellius. Pythagoras, who was very serious, apparently, about doing physiognomy to people, to tweens who wanted to get educated by him. Now, he was an educator of sorts. And if you went to his school, not only would he look at your body to make sure it was okay, but then he would make you be quiet for, like, years. You just had to sit there and listen, and you couldn't talk at all. Just listen and listen. At least 2 years. You'd be an auditor. It's like what auditors are supposed to do in college classes. Just sit there in silence. But then you could be deemed continent in words, and you might be allowed finally to ask some questions. Yeah, that's Pythagoras. He's a little guy who will make you be quiet for a long time in his house. Um, There's a lot of kind of stories like this about Pythagoras. Pythagoras is a dude who lived in the 6th century in Italy. He's originally from Samos, an island in the Cyclades, and he sailed to Italy, where he founded a little school, a little college, a little kind of a university. It was a vegetarian university, maybe. Um, Pythagoras is alleged by many sources not to have eaten meat. And not only not to have eaten meat, but just like not even to have wanted to hang around um, people who killed animals, people who were impure because they killed animals. Um, Now that purity thing is the key word here, because Pythagoras is probably not, maybe not an ethical vegetarian. He's not necessarily interested in ethical vegetarianism, although maybe he is. Talk about that in a bit. He's really interested in ritual purity. So it's not just the beef that you can't eat. You can't eat the beef, you can't eat the pork, you can't eat a lot of kinds of fishes, but well, you can't have loins, testicles, pudenda, bone marrow, feet, heads. Because this is another source that says that Pythagoras was okay with eating meat. He just said you couldn't eat certain kinds of meat. So you couldn't eat the loins of an animal, you couldn't eat the genitals of an animal for various ritual reasons. But the real bugbear for him is not just meat, but beans. Pythagoras is not a beans fan, a bean person. You get a lot of interesting explanations for this from classicists. There's a food sanitation issue. Pythagoras is supposed to have gotten favism from eating undercooked fava beans with a nice Chianti. He is supposed to have been disturbed by farting students. Beans cause gas. Lots of explanations from classicists mid-20th century. They came up with these kind of ad hoc explanations for what was going on with Pythagoras. We have explanations from the ancient world, which are a lot more interesting. Right? One of them is that beans are full of human stuff. If you chew up a bean, you will smell blood if you then spit it out. If you do an experiment with a bean, which he explains in this text here, you will see that a bean will transform into a tiny little head of an infant, or female genitalia. Lots of things that are wrong with beans. Beans are too democratic, he says. Lots of bean problems. Pythagoras is said to have died because he refused to tromp through a field of beans. This is after the local residents had gotten so angry at his university that they burnt the whole thing down and killed many of his followers and chased Pythagoras out of town, and they caught him at the edge of a bean field, and he wouldn't go over. Wouldn't go over the bean field, so they caught him and they killed him there. That's how Pythagoras died. Allegedly. There are other stories that say Pythagoras died of old age, years later after his university had been burned down. And that's the thing with Pythagoras. He did not write anything down. We have no authentic Pythagorean writings. We have lots and lots of stories told about him later on, some of which we've been looking at here. Stories about Pythagoras, stories about his little university, his secret society, his what have you. None of these date from anywhere close to Pythagoras' lifetime. None of the stories we looked at so far. These are all stories that show up in embedded in a text called Life of Pythagoras, which is Neoplatonic. It's late antique. It's hundreds of, in fact, about 1,000 years after Pythagoras lived. Um, we don't think we even have very many authentic quotes from Pythagoras. We got a couple few things preserved in a work of Aristotle, which is gone, against the Pythagoreans. But other people quote from that work, and so we find out that he thinks that the ocean is tears, and the constellation of the bear, Ursa Major, is Rhea's hands, Rhea the consort of Kronos, and Pleiades are the music. Muse is lyre, and the planets are Persephone's dogs, which is pretty metal. Uh, just as is Pythagoras' claim that the sound that bronze produces when you strike it is because there's a voice of a demon inside of it. That's the voice of the demon that's trapped in the bronze. That's what's going on there. So what's on screen here? The underlined words are essentially the only direct quotations from Pythagoras that we have. Not written down by him, transmitted by his followers. These are the ones, these like 4 or 5 little expressions are it. That's it for Pythagoras. Which means that Pythagoras is a fantastic screen for people to project their own interests on. And what Porphyry's doing, what the guy who wrote the text we've been looking at so far, what he's doing, seems to be using Pythagoras to create an alternative to Christianity, a philosophical, or some would say pagan, version of Christianity. What he's saying is that Pythagoras founded this kind of religious movement. He enforced strict rules, and some of the terms that Porphyry uses, acoustikoi in particular, his term for auditors, are actually terms that show up in religious movements like Manichaeanism and some Christian heresies in late antiquity. So it seems like he's setting up this imaginary Pythagorean society as an alternative version of the Christian church. He's figuring out a way to kind of build a community, a church-type community around philosophy, and then he's assigning a historical origin to this community way back in the past. That's not the only kind of substitute Christianity that philosophers in the 3rd century CE tried to develop, but a lot of them were interested in Pythagoras for this reason. Various people writing lives of Pythagoras. There's a Neo-Pythagorean movement that starts at this point, and some of that stuff becomes really influential in the Middle Ages and in the Islamic world. It is an alternative version of Christianity for which Pythagoras is the prophet, and that worships not God, but number. Because Pythagoras is one sort of consistent trait that gets assigned to him is that he is a number worshiper, a big believer in magic numbers. It is said that Pythagoras believed that all things were made of number. What does that mean? That is a very good question. Nobody really knows. Does it mean that things exist as proportion to one another? That everything is quantifiable? That everything is measurable? That there is a numerical measure to everything? Or is it something more literal than that? As some of his followers are said to have thought, people who would do things like draw a horse and fill that horse with pebbles and say the number of pebbles inside the horse was the number of the horse. Erytos is the name of the guy who did this. But that's a very literal way of taking the idea that all things are made of number, where you just like assign a number to things by filling them with pebbles. That's the number of the horse, the number of the person, the number of the plant. The alternative and slightly better attested idea is the other one that I talked about, which is that number is kind of the secret structure of everything that exists. That there is a secret numerical world behind everything. And the later tradition really does treat this numerical world as the object of cult worship by the Pythagoreans. They swear oaths by numbers, particularly by the tetractys, which is that fancy little shape on the right-hand side of the screen there. The tetractys is a triangle which contains the first four numbers, which add up to 10, which is, according to the Pythagoreans, the most perfect number. They love the number 10. They said that there were 10 planets. How did they get there? Were they very good at finding planets? Well, let's count them. You got the sun, you got the moon, you got Earth, you got Venus, you got Mars, you got Mercury. You got Jupiter, you got Saturn. You got the moon, we're one short. So, the Pythagoreans invented what's called an antikthon, the opposite Earth, an extra Earth, which is supposed to orbit around the sun opposite Earth, so we can never see it, and that's the 10th planet. So that's how you make sure that there are 10 planets, because 10 is the most perfect number. There are a lot of good stories about the Pythagoreans are very big on ratios. There are a lot of good stories about what happens when they discover something cool about numbers, like Pythagoras is supposed to have sacrificed 100 cattle when he discovered the Pythagorean theorem. Contradicts the idea that Pythagoras is a big vegetarian, but again, a lot of these stories are just kind of made up. Also, as you may or may not know, Pythagoras did not discover the Pythagorean theorem. It's just a math thing that was attached to the name of Pythagoras, like many math things in the Greek world. A lot of them were ascribed to Pythagoras or to his followers. He is supposed to have killed to keep the existence of irrational numbers a secret. Possibly also his followers killed to keep the existence of the icosahedron a secret. Very culty attitude towards numbers. Allegedly. He is supposed to have had this attitude towards numbers. Now, a lot of this, too, seems to be kind of post facto legend attached to Pythagoras rather than anything, like a historical truth of what Pythagoras was like. His followers, the ones that we do have work from, people like Archytas, are really interested in ratios, in harmony. They develop an early kind of theory of musical tuning using a very simple guitar called a monochord, which just has one string. They notice that if you press the string halfway down, you raise the note by an octave, and so on and so forth with the various other ratios. So they say that's evidence for number being very important to the structure of the world. What happens when we look a little bit more closely at a lot of these stories about number is that they seem to trace back to Plato and to Plato's followers pretending to be Pythagoreans. So it seems like Plato might have looked towards Pythagoras and his views about number as like a precedent for the idea, the world of forms. Plato's view of the world as based on forms, or as having forms in the background. Might even have ascribed to Pythagoras beliefs about number which were actually Plato's. Certainly, there is a lot of Platonic literature that postdates Plato, were like 100% on, that was ascribed to Pythagoras and his followers, that is trying to make it seem as though those people had Platonic ideas. In the same way, as modern philosophers look to Plato as something of an authority, people in Plato's time looked to Pythagoras as something of an authority, and an authority who hadn't actually written anything, so you could kind of have him say whatever you want, which is what Plato and the Platonists seem to have done. So here too, this vision of Pythagoras as like a number cultist is at least very exaggerated. Exaggerated by people who were interested in representing Pythagoras in a certain way in order to take advantage of the authority that Pythagoras' name carried. So here we're talking about 4th century BCE, still hundreds of years after Pythagoras' death, but again, people are really interested in inventing Pythagoras more than they're interested in discovering him. So for us, this poses a real problem. How do we figure out what Pythagoras was like, given that there are so many people in the ancient world who are interested in making us think that Pythagoras was like they wanted him to be? Well, it's a real problem of scholarship, and mostly it involves looking at sources that were openly hostile to Pythagoras, because with those at least, you know that they're not like trying to reshape Pythagoras after their own image. They are being abusive to Pythagoras, but there might be some grain of truth in that abuse. And ideally, you'd want those sources to be as close as possible to Pythagoras' lifetime, although that means in practice 3rd or 4th century BCE, because there's not a lot of stuff about Pythagoras that is written before that point in time. One exception is some mentions of Pythagoras in Herodotus' histories, which I will talk about in a second. So the nice thing is that the actual version of Pythagoras that we sort of recover from this critical approach is much cooler than either of the other versions of Pythagoras. He's not a weird cultist professor who makes you be quiet all the time. He's not a believer in numbers. He is kind of a magical wizard. He sometimes parts of his body just turned into metal. That's Pythagoras. He's the man with the golden thigh. He's hanging out in the theater and just, started exposing his leg to the audience members, and it turns out his leg's made of gold. He's not just an exhibitionist. He had a lot of out-of-body experiences. He's supposed to have flown about on a twig. He may have been a shaman, maybe. A shaman who could appear at multiple places at once, who could predict the future. We do have one good story about his faking his own death and resurrection, that he built a kind of a man cave and demanded that his mother take care of him, doing, among other things, the service of providing him news. So he went down there and he fasted for a long time, and then he came back and he went into town and he said that he had been dead for that whole period of time. And people believed him because he knew so much stuff that had happened, and they hadn't seen him for like a long while. So that was pretty good. Good trick. Led people to believe that he actually was a shaman or a wizard. Other people like Aristeas of Proconnesus seem to have maybe tried the same trick, done a lot of the same astral traveling, out-of-body experiences that Pythagoras did. Not necessarily that Pythagoras started any kind of religious movement, but he might have reflected religious ideas that were becoming current during his lifetime. In particular, people think the belief that there was a soul that could separate from the body. Because when Pythagoras claims he's having an out-of-body experience, that's what, for him, is going on. He's showing that he has a soul that is separated from his body. The soul is going somewhere else, is looking around, seeing things, and then it is coming back from his body, or to his body. So he's demonstrating, in fact, a separation of soul and body that later philosophy was to take for granted. Seems to have been where he was kind of going with his shamanism, and also why that shamanism had the appeal that it did, because he was, it seems like, a kind of a popular figure and a leader of men in southern Italy. So there is one belief, all of this is kind of a dog and pony show, but there is one belief that we are fairly sure that Pythagoras did have, and it's connected to this idea that the soul is separable from the body. We're fairly sure that Pythagoras believed in metempsychosis, in reincarnation, in the transmigration of souls. Not just from person to person, although in his case, he claimed to have been able to recall a long string of past lives that he had lived, other bodies in which his soul had been housed. But it seems like he also may have believed in transmigration of souls between humans and animals, which could have explained even possibly some of his discomfort at eating animal food. The wildest possibility is that Pythagoras might have believed in the transmigration of souls from humans into beans, which would explain why he was uncomfortable eating those beanos. Because those beans were actually human beings containing human souls. So that is the weird history of one of antiquity's earliest and wildest philosophers. That is Pythagoras. Watch out for beans. Don't murder roosters. Be good to the extent possible. But know that Pythagoras might have felt fine with your eating animal food. Just don't eat the gross parts. Speaking of gross animals, I will, as usual, wrap up the stream with a little bit of a picture of a cat that is here. Hi, cat. No, she's on to me. She's increasingly camera shy. Well, that's it for tonight, and I'll be back here next week.